Thank you for joining us for our February Q&A talk. My name is Cody McCray-Cullen, and I am the new Q&A Talks program coordinator at Project Q&A. Q&A Talks connect rural parents and caregivers of LGBTQIA+ youth with the resources they need to ensure their children can grow up safe and authentically. Q&A Talks is an initiative of Project Q&A and is made possible by grants from the Independence Era Community Chest and the American Library Association's Libraries Transform Communities focus on rural and small library grant in partnership with the Independence Public Library. Tonight, we are pleased to have Dr. Meg Paceley and Dr. Briana McGeough. And, sorry, lost my spot. And Dr. Meg Paceley is an associate professor at the University of Kansas School of Social Welfare and co-founder of the Center for LGBTQ+ Research and Advocacy. Their social work practice background includes establishing an LGBTQ+ community organization and providing direct practice experience with LGBTQ+ youth. Their research aims to transform the environments in which LGBTQ+ youth are situated to promote acceptance and affirming and reduce poor health outcomes. Dr. Briana McGeough is an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare at the University of Kansas and co-founder of the Center for LGBTQ+ Research and Advocacy. She earned her PhD and MSW from the University of California, Berkeley, and her BA in sociology from the university. Her research and practice focus on addressing mental health and substance use challenges among LGBTQ+ people. Please welcome Dr. Meg Paceley and Dr. Briana McGeough.
Thank you, Cody. We're excited to be here. All right, we just want to start. This is kind of what to expect during our time together. We're going to expand on our introductions just a little bit. I'm going to go over some general definitions just to kind of get us all started on the same page. Briana is going to talk about intersectionality, and then we're going to end with talking about allyship for gender diverse youth. And then, as usual, there will be a chance for Q&A in the Zoom outside of the Facebook Live session. So I'm Meg, my pronouns are they, them. I've been in Kansas for 7.5 years now. This is my second Project Q&A presentation, so I'm excited to be back with you. I think the first one was very early pandemic. And so, yeah, just excited to be here and excited to talk with you all. Briana, do you want to share anything else about yourself?
Sure. Yep. I'm Briana. I use she, her, hers. I've been in Kansas for about 4 years at this point. I grew up in Iowa, so not so far away. And yeah, I'm also just very excited to be here. I think it feels like a big time with all the stigma and like oppressive laws in the Kansas legislature at the moment. So it just feels like a really good time to be having these conversations. And I'm also super grateful that you all are joining us. So yeah, thank you.
Again, thank you both so much for being here, and whenever you're ready.
Thank you. And you all are here. You're here to support and be allies for gender diverse young people. So you may know these definitions, but there may be people that are new. And so we just kind of wanted to start with making sure that we're all on the same page and so that you understand some of the language we're going to be using tonight. So the first term is cisgender. And so this is when a person's gender assigned at birth is the same as their current understanding of their gender. So if a person is born, the doctor says it's a girl. This is usually based on visible sex characteristics. They grow up and still identify as a woman or as a female. They would be cisgender. Transgender is when one's gender assigned at birth is in some way different from their current understanding of their gender. And so this could look like lots of different things. This could be somebody who was assigned female at birth and now identifies as, or their understanding of their gender is as a man. It can be non-binary, genderqueer, lots and lots of ways that that could show up. And then we have non-binary, genderqueer, and many, many more definitions that fall outside the binary of male and female or man and woman. And this is really just when one's gender does not conform to this binary. And this can look lots and lots of different ways. And finally, we've been using the term gender diverse. And so this is a broad term that really encompasses all sort of non-cisgender identities. So people who are trans, non-binary, genderqueer, two-spirit, questioning their gender, and in any other way that they're identifying their gender that is, again, somehow different than their gender assigned at birth. I'll turn it over to Briana.
Great. And yeah, similarly, there are so many different definitions of intersectionality. I personally kind of like this one. Socially constructed categories of oppression and privilege, such as race, class, and gender and age, that simultaneously interact to create unique life experiences. And one of the things I like about it is that it highlights that intersectionality isn't just about people having identities, but is about the power, privilege, and oppression that can accompany those identities. And then I added in a kind of cutesy little graphic on the other side. The intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. Oppressions aren't isolated intersectionality now. And I think that just really highlights that when we're trying to do good work on behalf of, LGBTQ youth, that LGBTQ identities are diverse in their own ways, and they also intersect with so many other things. So they're just a lot of different social justice factors that play a role. And so one way to try to visualize this, and again, there are a whole host of identities, these are just a few, but on the graphic on the right, we have race, disability, sexual orientation, nationality, and gender identity. And this showcases that sometimes maybe a couple of identities can be at play in someone's lived experience in that moment, but sometimes it can be a whole bunch of different ones. And I like the graphic on the left, and that it highlights that idea of privilege and oppression that I was talking about earlier, that it's not just that people have identities, but that they get treated differently, both by individuals and by systems in response to those identities. So I don't know, I just found this quotation to be really powerful. It's Black and brown women who sweep the floors after white women break glass ceilings. And just, I think, really illustrating this idea that feminism can be a really powerful movement, and it in some situations can be a powerful movement for all women, but often it privileges particular types of women, often white women, often cisgender women, often women of higher socioeconomic statuses. So just one place where we have an example of a social justice movement that doesn't always equally uplift all members of a particular group. A little bit of background, I just want to give credit to where this framework of intersectionality comes from. So a few different folks really offered insight into this concept early on. One of the big pioneers here is Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw is full professor at the UCLA School of Law and coined the term way back in 1989. I think sometimes we talk about intersectionality like it's a fairly new idea, but people have been talking about it in this capacity since 1989, and I think using slightly different language since even before that. And what she really found in doing her work was that the experiences of women of color in the workplace looked very, very different than the experiences of white women, as well as the experiences of men of color in the workplace. And from doing that, she was trying to develop a framework that could explain why frameworks of racism and frameworks of sexism couldn't, in isolation, explain the differences that she was seeing. And yeah, I strongly encourage folks to continue educating yourselves on this topic after this talk today. And yeah, she has some awesome interviews on YouTube that I found really edifying. So I think there's just a whole bunch of other resources after today to continue learning more about this. One concept I find really useful in thinking about intersectionality is this idea of simultaneity. That people are members of more than one group at the same time and can also simultaneously experience oppression and privilege. I think it can be really appealing to sometimes describe groups of, like, people writ large as people in positions of power or people in positions of oppression, but the world's a lot more complicated than that. And I also like this framework because it can highlight that even folks who are extremely marginalized in a lot of ways can potentially hold power and be agents in their own liberation as well. So one example here is we might have a transgender student who's a really respected leader at school, but also experiences bullying in an academic context and a work context. So an example of this student in different places having really different experiences, and those could even be further complicated by other identities that that student holds. So I think one thing about intersectionality is it can sometimes feel a little abstract. So I was hoping that we could take a moment to do a quick activity to make this a little bit more concrete, and specifically make this a little bit more concrete for ourselves. And as we saw before, a whole bunch of identities can intersect with each other in different ways. So in this case, we'll be thinking about how one identity might impact a different identity, and it's still more complicated than that. But I think this can help make this a little bit more tangible, and again, a little bit more connected to how we think about ourselves in this conversation. So I created a little matrix here, and there are, in this case, 6 different identities in play. Race, gender, sexual orientation, ability status, class or socioeconomic status, and role. And again, there are so many more identities than that. But I think this matrix can be helpful in thinking about how one identity might impact the experience of another identity. So using myself as an example for a moment, I'm a white queer woman from a working class background, and I'm currently a college professor with a PhD. And those things can really impact how I experience other pieces of identity. So for instance, as a white woman in queer spaces, I often feel comfortable because of my racial identity. That I think is something that's often centered in LGBTQ spaces. Similarly, as a white woman, I think there's a lot of power I hold in feminist spaces. Thinking about how my class background impacts that, I think particularly I felt this pretty strongly when I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, that I think folks would often make these assumptions about what my background was or what I would potentially know, or like political views I might hold, having grown up fairly low income and also fairly low income in the middle of the country. And I also think that was sometimes mitigated by the fact that, I was getting my PhD out there. And so education played a role in terms of how folks were thinking about my socioeconomic status as well, particularly as a white person. I think in terms of, for instance, gender and sexual orientation, that often LGBTQ spaces are really oriented towards men, and sometimes not seeing much of an opportunity. Like I think gay bars are a really powerful example of this, that like you can go into there and I could potentially be the only woman in that space. And I'll skip through some of these other examples, but yeah, thinking about being a woman, but also a professor, there have been many experiences where I've said something and then like a male colleague says exactly the same thing and like it gets heard that time. So again, these are all just from my personal life, some examples of how a particular identity might shift another one. And again, I think it can be more complicated than that, but provides a little bit of an illustration. And I'd love to give folks an opportunity, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, to work through some of this for yourself. And again, you don't necessarily need to fill in every single box, but provide a few examples of how maybe your race impacts your ability, et cetera. So I know that, if we were in person, I'd be handing out these, but either just sort of thinking in your mind about it or writing down a few examples on a scratch piece of paper. So it might be quiet for a couple minutes, and then starting at 7:37, we'll come back. All right, let's come back. So now I'm going to transition a little bit towards thinking about our own roles in trying to support trans and gender diverse youth holding a variety of identities. And I think one thing I want to just normalize is that it can be so overwhelming to learn about all of the identities of youth that we're trying to support. And I want to just normalize that our sense of LGBTQ identities and some of the terminology and some of the intersections there are constantly evolving. Like, I'm often surprised when I talk to younger LGBTQ people that folks are often just using a whole host of identity terms that I wouldn't have considered using when I was, coming up with the correct labels for my own identities. And so that even someone who's, dedicates my life to this, sometimes am amazed at just how quickly these things evolve. And I think an important point here is you don't need to know everything to be an accepting caregiver. And it's also important to keep learning. So just because you potentially feel like it's really hard to keep up doesn't mean you should stop trying. And that everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes. But the best path forward is to apologize, learn, and try to not make the same mistake in the future. So all of this is a long-winded way of saying that supporting any youth can be really challenging, and there's a lot to know. And yet it's important to take responsibility and keep trying as you try to support a youth in your life. I think one key element of this is that it can be possible to participate in both accepting and rejecting behaviors. I think sometimes we create this false binary between like good accepting parents or caregivers and mean rejecting ones. And the reality is that most of us at some point or another will fall into both categories. And yet again, I think learning about what are accepting behaviors and examples of rejecting behaviors can help us to maximize the amount of time we spend engaging in accepting behaviors and minimize the time we spend engaging in rejecting behaviors, which is very, very important. So some examples of accepting behaviors include talking with youth about LGBTQ identities, advocating for youth when they're experiencing marginalization and discrimination. Meg is going to go into a lot more depth about what some of that might look like. Encouraging accepting behaviors from other relatives. So being a change agent in your family can be a really big deal for youth. And using inclusive language that honors your youth's intersecting identities. So whatever language they're choosing for themselves, using that language when talking about them and their identities, even if it wasn't language that you were familiar with growing up. Some examples of rejecting behaviors, excluding LGBTQ youth from family activities. I think sometimes folks, even well-meaning, have this idea that like other relatives aren't going to be supportive, so I shouldn't invite my kiddo to this family event. But it's a place where at least inviting the kiddo and giving them opportunities and then continuing to advocate for them in the space is really, really important. Sometimes I think folks get really concerned about the marginalization youth might experience and try to potentially change the LGBTQ youth sexual orientation or gender identity, or try to tell them to keep it a secret. And again, I think the important thing here is to just offer unconditional support. And so it is absolutely true. Like, we probably wouldn't be here if LGBT youth didn't experience marginalization. I think particularly trans and gender diverse youth experience a lot of that. But it can be stigmatizing to be told to keep those things quiet. And the way to show support instead is when these things come up, showing up for the kiddo and doing what you can to advocate for them in that context. And the last one there, telling a youth their sexual orientation or gender identity is sinful. Again, I think a lot of LGBTQ youth have experienced a lot of trauma from getting those kinds of messages from caregivers. I think another thing is like we're often going through our own process here. And behaviors intended to be supportive can be experienced by youth as rejecting. And so if you have the kind of relationship with a kiddo where they approach you and tell you that something that you did was rejecting, I think that can be really painful to hear, particularly if we're trying so hard to support kids. but being gracious, thanking them for their courage and telling you that, because I think that's a sign that they care about you and they trust you, and thanking them, and again, trying to behave differently in the future. And then just highlighting the importance of trying to maximize acceptance and minimize rejection is rejecting behaviors can be really harmful. And by minimizing rejecting behaviors, we can reduce risk for suicidality, depression, substance use, and unsafe sexual practices in our youth. And I think there's some really powerful research, particularly with trans and non-binary youth, that having even one supportive adult in their lives who uses the correct name, who uses the correct pronoun, and uses the identity labels that youth have chosen for themselves, just having one adult, even in an otherwise hostile climate, can have a significant impact in reducing these mental health challenges for trans kids. So key point being that even if you're in an unsupportive environment, doing what you can to show up is a really big deal for kids. And that even if we're struggling with our own beliefs or concerns about a child's identity, we can still support that youth and participate in affirming behaviors. So some of that processing can be really hard and challenging, particularly if, we grew up with belief systems. I certainly got a lot of oppressive messages growing up. But one important element is to keep behaving in affirming ways, even if it feels uncomfortable at first, even if, using your kids' chosen name feels uncomfortable, sticking with it and that kind of thing can get easier. I think another piece of that is finding your own private space to process some of those things. That might be therapy, that might be, a good friend in your life who's not close with your child, but that finding spaces to process that where your child doesn't need to bear the burden is also really valuable. And I think providing another example that I think we can often participate in things like policy advocacy as well, even if we're kind of ambivalent or working through our own stuff about our child's identities. So for instance, even if things still feel a little bit hard, advocating for access to a bathroom that's consistent with the child's gender identity is a really, really big deal and can be really impactful for kiddos. Again, even if you're sort of working through your own process of acceptance. So now I'll turn it over to Meg to discuss some other aspects of allyship for gender diverse youth.
Thanks, Briana. Yeah, so we're going to move into, as Briana said, sort of taking action and what can we do with all of this information. First, I want to talk about, what does it mean to be an ally? What is allyship? I think it's a word that sometimes gets thrown around pretty casually, and I think it's important that we really think about what does it mean if I'm being an ally to a community. Being an ally goes beyond support and acceptance, and it really goes towards action. And so when we think about allyship for gender diverse youth, we're talking about behaviors that are active, engaged, and ongoing. It's not a one-time, I corrected somebody's pronouns, or I, advocated for an inclusive bill or policy, but it's ongoing, right? It's as much as we can be engaged. We're supporting the rights, justice, and equity for gender diverse youth, and we're really acting against discrimination, stigma, and violence. And so it's all of these things. It doesn't mean you have to do every single thing that we're going to talk about next, but it is, again, active and ongoing. One thing I didn't put on here, but that we often talk about too, is that I don't get to identify myself as an ally to a community. I want to act in these ways that demonstrate my allyship, but it's really up to the community whether they see me as an ally, right? And so particularly as an adult, if I'm working with youth, I don't assume that they see me as an ally. I hope that they do. I hope that I'm working in a way that's consistent with what we're going to talk about, but they really get to decide if they see my work on behalf of them as somebody who's engaging as an ally. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about some examples. They're not all inclusive. These are just some things to think about and to get you started if you're kind of at the beginning of this. And if you're not, maybe they're ideas you haven't thought of. So sort of starting with the individual youth, as Briana said, using the name and pronouns that youth have told us, not questioning it. It might change, right? As part of their gender identity development process. They might be trying on different names or labels or pronouns and being okay with that, right? Kind of going with them, meeting them where they are. Asking them how they would like to be addressed in different situations. So they may want to be called a certain name when they're with you. This could be at home if you're the parent. This could be in your office if you're a social worker or a therapist. It could be in the classroom, you're the teacher. But it may be different if you see them out in public, maybe different if you see them with their parents. There's lots of different spaces where they might not want you to address them with their chosen name or pronouns. And so really asking them, you know, where is it okay for me to call you this name? Maybe it's everywhere, great, but you know that, right? And simultaneously ask them how they would like you to correct others who misgender or misname them. They may want you to correct people and they may not. Remembering that they may not be out to other people. And so making sure that we ask, and then of course we follow through, even if the young person isn't present. So yeah. And then I think also this is important, particularly for families and caregivers, providing opportunities for gender expression. And so offering assistance, finding clothing that feels affirming, providing safe spaces for youth to kind of experiment with different forms of expression. If that's something that they're interested in, I'd like to try to wear a skirt today in a place that feels safer, or, you know, whatever the situation is, helping them find spaces for that. And recognizing that gender diverse youth have, again, as Brianna's been talking about, multiple identities, age, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, all of these things, where they live, how rural their community is, and all of these experiences intersect. And so really thinking about what identities are youth holding and bringing, and asking them maybe, what identities feel important to you at school versus at home versus at church, whatever it may be. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thinking about allyship in schools, kind of going beyond what we just talked about, promoting trans affirming policies. We are seeing a huge backlash against trans and gender diverse youth in particular at state levels, but it's also happening at the community level. And so there are so many school boards that are proposing and passing policies that are really prohibiting access for trans and gender diverse youth. And so one way that we can be an ally is both by advocating against those discriminatory policies, which include things like mandating school staff share gender identity with parents, and that might not be safe for young people, book bans that include LGBTQ books, things like that. But also promoting trans affirming policies. So looking at, if it's your kid, looking at your kid's school, what policies do they have about dress codes, about anti-bullying and non-discrimination? Do they specifically name gender and sexual orientation? If not, how can we advocate to add those things? And there's some great resources on the GLSEN, GLSEN website about advocating for this type of policy. If you're in the school, you're a school staff, you can also support gender and sexuality support groups. They might be called GSAs, rainbow clubs. There's lots of different names they could have. Finding ways to support that and support youth in being leaders in that, if that's what they want. Educating other people in the school, particularly as if you're somebody that has this expertise or you're growing your own education around it. This could be formal education, like I want to provide a training, a continuing education opportunity for teachers. But it could also be one-on-one. Hey, Briana, I noticed that you used so-and-so's wrong name. Did you know that it's really important to use chosen names because, right? Because we're friends and I can have that sort of educational communication with my friend, right? And so doing those kinds of things, and really thinking also about the intersections, again, of marginalized identities. People often may need education on that as well, that being trans or gender diverse in different spaces also can be different for folks based on their other identities that they hold. A lot of the stuff we've talked about already kind of goes into allyship with parents, so there's only a couple on here. Briana talked about the acceptance and rejection really applies to parents. There's so much research about how most families aren't fully accepting or fully rejecting, but like some combination of both. And so finding ways to like help families and parents veer more towards like the more accepting behaviors. Some of that is going to be through education. And what I've found really helpful in working with parents is meeting them where they are. What can we find common ground about? And often the common ground is that they love their child and they want them to be safe. And I want their child to be safe too, right? And so how can we work together, even if they're not at a place of full acceptance, to minimize those rejecting behaviors, because we know that that promotes safety for the child. And so meeting them where they are, it may not be where I want them to be yet, but I'm hoping we can get there if we start where the parent's at. Connecting the parent with trans affirming resources, such as PFLAG or other groups for parents of trans and gender diverse youth. And then one more, I think, it's thinking about our role in communities. So some of this is school related, but it can also go beyond. Again, we've got these anti-trans policies that also intersect with other oppressive policies that are, racist, sexist, et cetera. So, there's been 3 or 4 already heard in the Kansas legislature this week, thinking about what influence might you have? Can you share about these policies with people who might want to testify or who might want to show up and advocate against them? Do you want to do those things, right? So how can we be visible in our opposition to these types of policies that we know harm gender diverse youth? And then of course, right, it's not just minimizing harm, but like promoting acceptance too. So advocating for trans affirming policies at the state and community level. Displaying signs of support and affirmation. In so many studies that I've done, when I talk to trans youth and I ask them, like, what's helpful in your community? What's helpful in your school? They say, I walk by this restaurant and they've got a rainbow flag or a trans flag in their window, and I might not ever go in there, but I know that if I'm feeling unsafe or if I have to go to the bathroom, like that's a place that I feel like I could probably go, right? And so having those signs of support and affirmation sends a message to trans and gender diverse youth of acceptance, of support. And then of course we have to follow through, right? We can't have the sign on our door and then have the experience in our restaurant or store be harmful, but making sure that we're like following through on that as well. And of course, opposing hostile rhetoric and language around trans folks and other oppressive forms of language and behavior. So challenging anti-trans, quote unquote jokes or racist language, things like that, and really standing up, right, and saying this isn't okay in my community. So we threw a lot at you, but we do have time for Q&A. I'll turn it over to Cody about how we're going to do that.